Hi, everyone. Henry here, and welcome to what I would consider a test pilot for, I'm going to call a rough draft for Sunday school. I'm going to steal from Paul Vanderklay, and I'm going to try and get myself into the corner. Since talking in front of a camera about the church and faith and spirituality and philosophy and religion is super popular, I've been doing this with my church community for so long, I might as well get in on it. I have been teaching Sunday school for a little while now. I run more or less my church's young adult group, and we've been going through this call to the basics and fundamentals of the church. So we recently went through the characteristics of God, went through Exodus 34, kind of using John Mark Comer's God Has a Name as kind of my base text for research, and using a lot of that material as the springboard for content. And then I talked very briefly about leading into Jesus. We were just like, all right, what's the significance of like the temple and kind of preeminent Christ-like prophecy? And with Sunday school now, we're finally getting to Jesus himself. And I wanted to start by talking about painting the picture of the historical Jesus per se, or at least the best picture you can paint of Jesus within the text. So there are previous attempts that have been made to figure out who the historical Jesus is. Looking at some kind of previous scholarship, a lot of it's agenda-driven, especially in the Enlightenments. A lot of these very European, post-Christian kind of thinkers and writers applying their post-Christian enlightened thoughts to Jesus, and it's not great, right? There's an attempt to fit Jesus into a mold of the present day, depending on when the text was written, right? These biographies. And that exists today. That trouble still exists, right? We need to understand who Jesus was and is, but if we don't have an understanding of who God is, our own ideas of the world and our own way we perceive ourselves and we think of the world and the way things are then gets grafted onto or painted onto God or onto Christ. So, if you are more left-leaning and tolerant in these things, Jesus is going to be love is love and this kind of hippie type, maybe West Coast Californian. Or if you are in the conservative spheres, maybe conservative South that I grew up in, Jesus is going to be about your guns in America and all of that. And I don't think either of those is a really correct way to go about seeing Jesus. Keep in mind, I haven't been able to do as much research as I would like to, going through some of this stuff and kind of prepping on a week-by-week basis. You kind of realize that there's so much content that you maybe want to talk about, and you can't fit it all into like 1 or 2 weeks if you're kind of going on a particular pace, right? So the bottom, as you might say, just keeps getting further from you, like the traveling down the depths of like the Jesus rabbit hole. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Anyway, but the question, right, goes like, how does one go about figuring out what Jesus was like? What was his goal in his earthly ministry? And the Sunday school answer would be like, well, you read the Bible, right? But you need to have like a total comprehensive knowledge of the Old Testament. You need to understand the history with Israel and the prophetic tradition that exists. And you need to understand the cultural, historical, political, social climate of Israel in Rome in the first century. It's loaded. And I've been using Wright's New Testament in its world as, again, like a kind of ground and jumping off point for a lot of this. And that's been super helpful, and I find that really interesting. As a sidebar, Wright's Paul biography really kind of got me into this new stage of scholarship and looking at how to like handle scripture and thinking about, these key figures in the Bible, as real people, or help fleshing those images out and those ideas out. And that's been really cool. Anyway, the goal of the Sunday school lesson, and I guess of this video, how long it takes, is to at least set some sort of groundwork for independent study for the Sunday school should curiosity peak on the unending depth of Jesus' earthly ministry and all that surrounded and influenced it. And then also set the framework to discuss Jesus' interaction with the temple as the temple himself, and ultimately the significance of his death and resurrection. Again, I'm doing like a lot of groundwork, going back to basics and stuff, which in some sense I'm going back to the basics as well, because I haven't reviewed this content in this light, in this way, before. There's a lot, and I've been struggling to figure out how to organize it and what's most important for a survey of this kind for a lesson. So going to the start, we're going to look at the roles and functions of Jesus' ministry. First, Jesus is Jewish. I think a lot of people in academia also like to make this point for other reasons. Sometimes it's political, social, to like reclaim Jesus away from the Christian West in some respects. But for the sake of this discussion, right, we just need to know that he's Jewish because Christ comes from a long, long history of God dealing with humanity through the nation of Israel. And we'll see in a minute, right, Christ is, by all accounts, what was promised according to the prophecies, according to the prophets and other texts. So Yahweh, God, promises to Abraham that he will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. In Genesis 12, 2-3, he says, I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. So then the question is like, well, how does Abraham become a blessing to all the families of the earth? And we'll get to that in a minute. This promise is echoed and reaffirmed by the promise of Yahweh to David after he desires to build a temple for the Lord, right? Just a real brief kind of scripture, 2 Samuel 7:16, your house and your kingdom shall be made forever before me, your throne shall be established forever. So we have Abraham first being promised that he will be the father of many nations and a blessing to all the families of the earth. And then we have a second promise that's established that Yahweh says, David, your lineage and your kingship will not end. It will exist forever. And so you have two promises that the people of Israel are banking on, and these two promises are predicted to be fulfilled kind of simultaneously in some of the prophetic texts, which we'll look at in just a second. So the history of Israel has a constant motif of exile and homecoming throughout. There's national disobedience, which leads to some sort of punishment, usually through exile. And then post-exile, there's usually some sort of deliverance, or we'll say salvation, right, in the realized sense. Rinse and repeat, right, across all of history. Judges, you look at later on, even during David's reign, he even has his own kind of disobedience, exile, and deliverance. This motif exists on a bunch of different levels across the Old Testament. And so by the time you hit, or before you hit the time of Jesus, you're in kind of like the peak of great exile, or Israel is, right? The Shekinah glory and the Spirit of the Lord has departed from the temple, as warned by Ezekiel, and the nation lived through, or without the bridge between heaven and earth, which was the Spirit, which was the proper temple, for like 400 something years. And then you hit Rome, and the Jews are occupied there, or under, Roman rule, and that's like the worst thing for them. This desire for revolt and for an overthrow through the Messiah or other means is bubbling and brewing at the time. You have your different sects of the faith there, kind of at odds with one another, but all with this common goal of like, get Messiah in place, get Rome out of here, reestablish the nation of Israel the way it should be. We see that, of course, later, even post-ascension with Jesus, in which a lot of zealots and other radicals did openly revolt and take down Rome, which happened and then ended with the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70. So, setting that groundwork, again, this very brief survey of these things, Jesus arrives at the perfect time, at the climax of Israel's history, to usher in a new age, right? At the height of exile, like the worst exile you could get. Rome is the world, and Israel has been, contained and captured by the world, by this oversweeping kingdom, by this king who declares himself God, Caesar, right, or the Son of God. You have, right, this long period of time without the Spirit, without the Shekinah glory. And you had moments before in the Old Testament in which it was absent, right? The Philistines had it for a while, around the time or before David, and it was returned to them via the ark, right? And you get moments where you can see how crushing it is to be without the Spirit of the Lord. And so Israel has been without it for 400 something years. So Jesus is coming into a long history, or right at the tail end of like this really long history, right, as it's hitting its peak in literature, right, as the top of the story mountain, the climax. Jesus was also Jewish in practice, of course, right? He's raised in a Jewish home, right, because Joseph and Mary are of this lineage and stuff. Joseph comes from loosely the line of David, so that, right, Christ kind of checks that box of being a part of that. And then, of course, through the Immaculate Conception, right, he is then also fully God. That's Trinity, Christology stuff that I'm not going to get into in this. But then, like in the text as well, Jesus says, right, about himself in Matthew 15 or 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So not only does this establish and confirm Jesus' righteousness and sinlessness in fulfilling the law, but Jesus also understands the law and the prophets, the Torah, and these other, laws that are put in place that the Jews should have been, if not were, practicing and putting in place. So that's kind of the groundwork. And then we get to Jesus as prophet, and this is kind of where the bulk of the content comes up, and we'll see where discussion goes tomorrow. But in Deuteronomy 18, Moses says, right, or through Yahweh, or Yahweh through Moses says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. Anyone who does not heed the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold accountable." This message from Yahweh does and can speak of a lot of different prophets: Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Jonah, etc., all of whom can then fit the mold of what is declared here. Right? So not only talking about a bunch of different prophets, it can also refer to Jesus, who in his earthly ministry reflected and emulated the works and words of those prophets before him. Jesus himself declares himself to be a prophet in Luke 4, right? When he comes to Nazareth and preaches in the Sabbath, or on the Sabbath day, he opens the scroll and reads out of Isaiah 61 and says, "Yep, this has been fulfilled in your day. And I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown." So he's declaring himself that, because almost immediately afterwards, he gets tossed out by those he used to consider family or neighbors in Nazareth. And then later, others too declare Jesus as a prophet. In Matthew 16, 13 to 14, others ask, right, Jesus asks, "Well, who do people say I am?" And they say, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets, because Jesus is pulling from a couple of these different prophetic traditions. Then the question is, okay, what's a prophet? And again, we're just jumping back and kind of reminding myself, and then also those I'm teaching tomorrow, what this is, right? So broadly speaking, the function of the prophet is that of speaking on behalf of Yahweh and exposing the sinful practices of the nation of Israel and calling the nation to repentance. So example, right before Jesus, you have John the Baptist, kind of the last in the line of prophets before Christ, calls out Herod Antipas for his adultery, and then this leads to an imprisonment and beheading. Herod was king of the Jews and therefore was part of the nation and had rule over the rest of this group. And so John, right, in fulfilling that tradition, much like Nathan the prophet to David, right, calls Herod out for this, which is not met in the way that Nathan gets, right? Not rewarded per se, but he's spared, right? And David repents. This does not happen with Herod. And then another example comes from Jonah, right? Jonah is called outside of Israel, kind of looking instead of correction within, correction without, or outside of the nation. Jonah is called to Nineveh about imminent destruction. This leads to Nineveh's repentance in Jonah. And then Jesus, of course, echoes the prophets. Ezekiel predicted the departure of the Shekinah glory from the temple, and then Christ then later predicts the destruction of the temple. Just parallels. Jeremiah ran the risk of being deemed as a traitor to Israel, and then Christ was like public enemy of the Pharisees and others, so much so that they struck a deal with Rome to have him crucified. Right? Same kind of public enemy number one, despite being for the nation like Jeremiah. And then Jesus also directly compares Jonah's dwelling in the fish for 3 days to what would soon come about, which would be his dwelling in the earth in death for 3 days before his resurrection. So that's just kind of a brief survey of Jesus as a prophet, right? If you're going to go through, fun challenge for myself and for others would be to just like highlight any place Jesus refers to himself as a prophet, anytime the prophets of the Old Testament are referenced, prophetic language that Jesus uses, right? Rebuking leaders or correcting them. Fun exercise, something to do. And then kind of last place to hit in terms of a survey would be Jesus as Messiah and King. So going back to the promises, right? Yahweh tells Abraham he will be a blessing to all families of the earth. And then later he says, David, your line's going to reign forever. So prophecy says that this Messiah, this hero that will rescue the nation and rule the earth and judge the earth, will come out of the line of David. Isaiah 11, 1-5 says this: a shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of Yahweh shall rest on him. Skipping it a little bit, he shall be in delight, shall be in the fear of Yahweh. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. So this is that confirmation of David's promise being fulfilled through the Messiah, which is really cool. And then Daniel 7:13-14 kind of better describes the arrival of one like a human, coming before the Ancient One, God, to serve over the nations, right? To him was given glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. So all peoples, all nations, and languages, right? This is going beyond the Jewish family, going beyond Abraham's direct family. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So Israel's banking on this hard, right? They're under Rome. This sucks. This is a disgrace. They don't want this. And so they're looking for military conquest. They're looking for Rome to fall. They're looking for the nation of Israel to be reestablished. And of course, this does not happen in the way that Israel had anticipated, which is its own lesson and its own discussion that, for the sake of the Sunday school tomorrow, we're not going to do, because there's so much already to go through. And then also taking into consideration conversation, questions, things that come up. Right, but to kind of go back to that, Jesus, of course, rather than, taking over Rome, dies to Rome, technically, and is subject to their worst torture and execution. But then, of course, we see Christ's fulfillment as Messiah and ruler of the nations, and one that can overthrow Rome in what happens culturally, socially, with the rise of what we now say is ancient Christianity at the time, right? That movement budding and growing through Acts, through the work of Paul, through the early church in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, right? Rome does fall eventually, but it's not as immediate as Israel would like, and salvation comes about and deliverance comes about, but it's not in the way that they expected. So what's Jesus offering? And that's kind of how we'll close out the lesson. First off, it's citizenship in the kingdom of heaven on earth. N.T. Wright likes to bring up all the time that the faith is more than just getting into heaven someday, because heaven is brought to earth in the faith. Jumping ahead or jumping the gun a little bit, in the faith, one bears the Spirit, right, the Shekinah, as a temple in of itself, right? We become the intersection between heaven and earth, which I think is the coolest thing, and I could ramble about that forever, but not today. So Jesus at the time, present in his earthly ministry, offered healings and miracles. This is an intersection of heaven and earth and a demonstration of these things. He also brings, of course, access to Yahweh through salvation by faith or trust in the work and character of Jesus Messiah through himself. And then also he brings about greater meaning and purpose, divine purpose, right? To bring heaven to earth, bringing about the restoration of the world as anticipated by the prophet Isaiah and Israel for centuries. Closing out as remarks, right? Jesus is running contrary to what the nation in the 1st century was anticipating. And one of the reminders, I think, that is lost on many in Israel of the rulers and those in the higher places, they forget and misunderstood that citizenship in heaven was never meant to be exclusive to the Jews. Remember, again, Yahweh promised Abraham he'd be a blessing to all the families of the earth. The law speaks on many occasions of loving one's neighbor beyond the nation of Israel, right? Turns into like, who's my neighbor, right? Jesus isn't pulling that out of thin air. This isn't something that's novel to him. It's reintroduced to the world, but it exists as early back as Deuteronomy in these places. And that's lost on the nation in a lot of instances. Keep in mind also in Jesus's encounter in Nazareth, in preaching, right? He says that Healing only occurred twice in the time of the prophets, and both recipients were the Gentiles and not people of Israel, and that lights everybody up in the synagogue there against him. Of course, there's that pushback. Israel functionally was supposed to be the light of the world, and there's that repeated missing of the mark, right? History of disobedience, exile, and homecoming. This is partly, of course, to highlight the impossibility of the standard for mankind until Christ. It highlights the necessity of grace and mercy from Yahweh in these things. But it still exists nonetheless. And one of Israel's greatest mistakes is, in the first century, believing that they were the sole recipients of salvation and blessing by Yahweh. Again, the Pharisees see it in these ways. They have this desire to uphold these purification rites in order to maintain righteousness, to not stall the arrival of the Messiah. There's a separateness that is recorded not only kind of in the New Testament, of course, but also in Josephus and some other historical writings that, the Jewish people really didn't like anybody else who wasn't within the nation, right? There was an exclusivity to it. But Israel, per the Abrahamic covenant and promise to David, was to be the means by which God worked in the world. And this work, of course, culminated in the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ. By means of work in the world, the means of the work in the world did not necessarily guarantee, though, that Israel would be the recipients of what was promised, right? There's a difference between being worked through and receiving, right? Israel is the nation by which the Messiah comes, but that does not necessarily mean parts of the nation would then actually receive Christ as who he was and said he was as Messiah for Israel and for the world. That's more or less Sunday school rough draft and a test pilot for all of this here. We'll see what comes about with this. Again, trying to get myself into the corner and part of the discourse and conversation. That's all I'm looking to do. Hope you enjoyed and got something out of it.